Imagine being 30,000 feet in the air, trapped in a confined space with a man who isn't what he claims to be, and the only person who knows the truth is a flight attendant. Naomi Carter thought it was just another routine flight, until she noticed a little girl with terrified eyes and a silent plea for help. But when she made her move, the man sitting beside the child knew she was on to him. What would you do if the only thing standing between a helpless child and a dangerous predator was you? Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Naomi Carter had been working as a flight attendant for nearly a decade. She had seen just about everything at 30,000 feet. Passengers arguing over overhead space, turbulence that made even the seasoned flyers grip their armrests, and once, a man who tried to sneak a full pizza onto the plane in his carry-on. But nothing had prepared her for Flight 227 to Miami. It started like any other long-haul shift. The early morning air at Chicago O'Hare was crisp, the kind that stung your face but woke you up better than a shot of espresso. Naomi stood near gate 32, adjusting the navy blue scarf tucked into her uniform, her badge clipped neatly to her lapel. As passengers lined up for boarding, she offered polite smiles, the kind that felt automatic after years in the industry. "Welcome aboard," she said to an elderly couple who shuffled in, their matching sweaters making them look like a holiday postcard. She nodded at a businessman with AirPods wedged into his ears, lost in whatever world existed beyond the plane's narrow aisle. It was all routine, predictable. Then a man stepped forward with a little girl. He was tall, well-dressed in an expensive but understated suit. Dark hair, sharp jawline, the kind of confidence that came from knowing you could command a room without saying much. The girl, on the other hand, was quiet in a way that made Naomi's stomach clench. Kids on flights were usually one of two things: excited chatterboxes or restless bundles of energy. This girl was neither. She clutched a small stuffed rabbit, its fur worn and matted from years of being held too tightly. Her brown curls framed a face that should have been filled with curiosity, but her eyes darted around like she was waiting for something bad to happen. The grip she had on the man's hand wasn't the easy, trusting hold of a child with her father. It was rigid, fingers curled like she was afraid to let go. Naomi felt something stir in her gut, a flicker of unease. "Good morning," she greeted, her voice gentle. The man flashed a quick, effortless smile. "Morning. Just me and my niece today." There it was, the explanation before she even asked. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Naomi crouched slightly, making eye contact with the girl. The child hesitated. Her lips parted just slightly, but before she could speak, the man's hand gave the smallest squeeze on her shoulder. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. "Riley," he answered for her, still smiling. Something was off. Naomi had seen kids who were shy, kids who didn't like talking to strangers. But this wasn't shyness. This was silence that had weight to it, the kind that pressed down like a secret too big to carry alone. She forced a pleasant nod, stepping aside to let them board. Maybe she was overthinking. Maybe it was just an overprotective guardian and a kid who didn't like airports. But as they made their way down the jet bridge, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. And she had no idea how much that feeling was about to change everything. Naomi had spent years learning how to read people. It was an unspoken skill in her job, something that came with time. How to tell the difference between a nervous first-time flyer and someone genuinely up to no good. As she made her way down the aisle, checking that passengers were settling in, her eyes kept drifting back to him. Seat 14B. The man who had introduced himself as Riley's uncle. He sat upright, legs crossed, skimming through his phone like he had nothing in the world to worry about. But Naomi noticed the little things. How he kept one hand resting lightly on the armrest between them, just close enough to Riley to keep her within reach. How his eyes flicked up every so often, scanning the cabin in quick, sharp glances. Riley sat stiffly beside him in 14A, hands locked around that battered stuffed rabbit. She hadn't said a word. Not to him, not to anyone. Something wasn't right. Naomi wasn't reckless. If there was one thing she had learned working in aviation, it was that jumping to conclusions could land you in serious trouble. But there were other things, instincts that didn't just go away, because logic told you to ignore them. She made a decision. Passing by their row, she knelt slightly so that she was at Riley's eye level. "Would you like something to drink, sweetheart?" A small test. Something simple. A chance to see how she responded on her own. For a second, Naomi thought Riley might answer. Her lips parted, but before she could get a word out, the man's fingers tapped lightly against her armrest. Not hard, not obvious, but a message all the same. Riley's mouth shut. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head, just stayed still. Naomi smiled as if she hadn't noticed, but her pulse had picked up. That wasn't normal. That wasn't okay. She straightened, forcing her voice to remain light. "And for you, sir?" "Just water, thanks," he said smoothly. Naomi gave a quick nod and moved away, but her mind was already racing. She needed to be careful. She needed to be sure before she did anything more. Reaching the galley, she poured the water and set it on a tray. Next to it, she placed a cup of juice for Riley. Then, in a move so quick it was instinct, she grabbed a napkin and a pen from her apron pocket. She hesitated for a second. Then she wrote, "Are you okay?" It was risky, but the alternative, doing nothing, felt worse. Returning to their row, she handed the man his water first, keeping her face neutral. Then, as she leaned slightly to give Riley her drink, she slipped the napkin onto her tray, folding the corner just enough so it was visible. Riley's fingers twitched. Her eyes locked onto the note like she had been waiting for someone to ask that question. But before she could do anything, before she could even reach for the cup, the man's hand casually moved. Not rough, not aggressive, but precise. He plucked the napkin off the tray, crumpling it effortlessly into his palm like it was nothing more than trash. Naomi's stomach dropped. He knew, and for the first time he looked directly at her. No more polite smiles, no more practiced charm. His eyes held something else now, a warning. Naomi forced herself to keep moving, her hands steady even as her heart pounded. She had just made herself part of this. And whatever was happening in seat 14A, Riley needed help. Naomi felt the weight of that crumpled napkin long after she had walked away. She had made a mistake. No, not a mistake. A misstep. The man in 14B had caught on too quickly. He knew she suspected something, and now he would be watching her just as closely as she was watching him. But she couldn't ignore this. Not now. She busied herself in the galley, wiping down already spotless counters, her mind racing. There were protocols for situations like this, human trafficking suspicions, child endangerment, but they all required certainty. She had gut instincts, but instincts weren't evidence. She needed a way to confirm, to act without tipping him off again. Then from the corner of her eye, she caught something. Riley. The little girl was turned ever so slightly in her seat, just enough that Naomi could see her face from where she stood. Her fingers, still curled around the stuffed rabbit, moved just a fraction. Small, hesitant. And then it happened. She lifted her hand just barely and pressed her thumb and index finger together in a subtle motion. It was so slight that if Naomi hadn't been looking, she might have missed it. But she knew what it meant. A silent plea. A help me signal. Naomi's breath hitched. She had been trained to recognize these signs, subtle gestures children used when they were too scared to speak. It was an international distress signal for kids in danger, one that law enforcement had tried to spread awareness about for years. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just her feeling uneasy anymore. This was real. She had to act. But how? Damon, because she was done calling him the man in 14B, was already on high alert. He'd caught her slip up with the napkin. If she made another move too soon, she could push him into doing something rash. She needed help. Steeling herself, she stepped toward the cockpit. There was one person on this flight with the power to make an immediate decision, and she had to convince him before it was too late. The cockpit door was closed, but Naomi knocked twice, firm and steady. A second later, the door cracked open, revealing Cooper Hale, the flight's captain. A seasoned pilot in his early 50s, he had the look of someone who had seen it all, the emergencies, the near misses, the unpredictable chaos that came with the job. But what Naomi was about to tell him was not part of the standard manual. "Captain," she said quietly, stepping inside and making sure no passengers were in earshot. "I need to talk to you." Cooper's brow furrowed. "Something wrong?" She took a breath. I think we have a child trafficking situation on board. His reaction was immediate. His posture straightened, and his expression shifted from mild concern to dead serious. Tell me everything. She did, quickly. The uneasy body language, the way Damon spoke for Riley instead of letting her answer, the napkin, the way he had crumpled it up without even looking at it. And then the thing that mattered most, Riley's silent distress signal. When she finished, the cockpit was quiet for a beat. Then Cooper exhaled sharply. Damn! Naomi nodded. I know it's not hard evidence, but I'm not imagining this. She's scared, and he knows that I know something's wrong. Cooper was silent for a moment, then turned toward his co-pilot, Grant Taylor, who had been listening intently. Can you discreetly check the passenger manifest? Grant nodded, pulling up the flight records. A few taps on the screen, and then he frowned. Here's the thing. This guy, Damon Rourke, he's listed as her legal guardian. Documentation's clean. Naomi clenched her jaw. That doesn't mean it's real. Cooper gave a slow nod. No, it doesn't. But airlines don't typically question papers that check out, unless someone on board says something's off, Naomi finished for him. Another pause. Then Cooper's fingers drummed lightly against the console. All right, here's what we do. We can't confront him mid-flight. It's too risky. We also can't let him know we're on to him. But we can alert the authorities so that when we land, they're ready. Naomi exhaled. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Cooper leaned forward, lowering his voice. Here's the problem. If he senses we're setting something up, he could get desperate. We need to keep things as normal as possible until touchdown. Naomi understood. She needed to act like nothing had changed, even though everything had. Cooper keyed into the radio. I'll make the call, but Naomi, be careful. She nodded. Always. As she stepped out of the cockpit, she took a deep breath. She had done the first part. She had set the wheels in motion. Now she just had to make sure Damon didn't catch on before they landed. Naomi stepped back into the cabin, forcing herself to breathe normally, to walk naturally as if nothing had changed. She was trained for this. Flight attendants dealt with emergencies all the time. Medical situations, unruly passengers, mechanical issues. But this was different. This wasn't turbulence or a sick passenger. This was a man who might hurt a child if he realized the walls were closing in on him. She couldn't let Damon sense even a flicker of tension. As she moved down the aisle, she did what she always did. Checked on passengers, refilled drinks, smiled where it was necessary, but her focus was on one row only, 14A. Damon sat with the same calm, unreadable expression as before. His phone was in his hand, thumb moving in slow, deliberate motions across the screen. He wasn't scrolling mindlessly like most passengers. He was texting someone. Naomi's stomach tightened. Who? She glanced toward Riley. The little girl hadn't moved. Her stuffed rabbit sat limp in her lap, fingers still curled around its worn fur. Naomi made a split-second decision. She approached casually, her voice light. Everything okay here? Damon looked up, his expression smooth as glass. Fine. Naomi nodded as if she believed him. Then she turned her attention to Riley. Sweetheart, are you doing all right? Need anything? Riley didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes met Naomi's. And in them, Naomi saw everything. She didn't need words. The fear was there, plain as day. Actually, Damon interrupted, shifting slightly, I think we're good. A dismissive brush-off, a polite way of saying, leave us alone. Naomi hesitated just for a beat, then smiled. Of course. Let me know if you need anything. She turned and walked away, but she felt his eyes on her the entire time. Her heart pounded. Something was about to happen. She could feel it. Naomi slipped into the galley, her hands gripping the counter. The weight of what she was doing pressed against her chest, but she couldn't afford to falter. She needed to act now. Pulling out her phone, she discreetly typed a message into the airline's internal system, routing it to the Miami Airport security office. Suspicious passenger, potential child endangerment, requesting immediate security presence at gate upon landing. Flight 227. She sent it, deleted her draft, and tucked the phone away. Done. The authorities would be waiting. Now she just had to get through the next 2 hours without Damon realizing the trap had been set. Then as she turned to leave the galley, she heard something. A click, a seatbelt unfastened, and then footsteps. Someone was moving toward her. Naomi spun around and came face to face with Damon Rourke. His expression wasn't threatening. If anything, it was neutral, polite. But that was the problem. He was too calm. "Hey," he said smoothly, his voice just low enough that no one else could hear. "Can I ask you something?" Naomi forced a professional smile. "Of course." Damon studied her for a second, then spoke, his tone light. "You seem tense. Everything okay?" The question hit her like a blade wrapped in silk. He knew, or at least he suspected. Naomi had spent years perfecting the art of staying composed, but right now she was walking a razor-thin line. "Everything's fine," she said, keeping her voice even. "Just a long shift." Damon smiled, a knowing smile. "Of course," he murmured. "Long shifts can be exhausting." He tilted his head slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. "I just hope you're not worrying about something you shouldn't be." The meaning was clear. Stay out of this, and Naomi's pulse thundered, but she didn't blink, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her waver. Instead, she smiled, the same practiced flight attendant perfect smile she had used 1,000 times before. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Rourke." And with that, she turned away. But she knew without a doubt this was only the beginning. Naomi walked away from Damon, her pulse hammering in her ears. He had made his move, subtle, calculated, but unmistakable. That wasn't a casual conversation. That was a warning. She forced herself to keep her pace steady, her movements normal, even as her mind raced. Damon suspected something. Maybe he didn't know about the message she had sent, but he knew she was watching him, and that meant he would be watching her too. Back in the galley, Naomi leaned against the counter and exhaled slowly, trying to gather her thoughts. She had done what she could, alerted the authorities, put Damon on notice without tipping her full hand. Now she had to wait, but waiting felt impossible. She grabbed a water bottle from the storage cart, using the excuse of hydration to steady her trembling fingers. The next few hours would determine everything. She couldn't afford another mistake. Then from her peripheral vision, she caught something. A movement in row 14. Riley. The little girl shifted slightly in her seat, her stuffed rabbit slipping from her grasp. As she reached down to grab it, her eyes flicked toward Naomi. And for the briefest second, there it was again. That same look, that silent plea. Naomi's breath caught. "Hold on, sweetheart. We're almost there." But then, Damon leaned in. He whispered something to Riley, his hand resting lightly on the armrest between them. Not touching her, just close enough. Whatever he said made her go rigid. The rabbit lay forgotten on the floor. Naomi's fists clenched at her sides. Damon wasn't just keeping her quiet. He was reminding her who was in control. And that, more than anything, made Naomi's resolve harden like steel. She wasn't just going to report this. She was going to make sure Riley got out of this safe, whatever it took. Time passed in slow, agonizing increments. The cabin hummed with the quiet murmur of passengers, the occasional ding of a call button, the steady drone of engines cutting through the sky. Naomi kept moving, kept up the act of a flight attendant, just going about her routine. But every second, she was counting down to landing. She had to be smart. If Damon was suspicious now, what would he do when they started their descent? Would he try to leave first, force his way through the crowd before security could get to him? Would he make a scene? Or, Naomi's stomach twisted, would he hurt Riley if he thought he had nothing left to lose? She couldn't risk it. She needed one final confirmation, a way to know for certain. She grabbed a notepad from the galley, the kind flight attendants use for special passenger requests, and scribbled a quick message in small, neat letters. "Do you need help?" Then, keeping her body language relaxed, she walked back into the cabin. Damon was watching her. She felt it before she even reached their row. His gaze was steady, unreadable. Naomi didn't look at him. Instead, she bent down and picked up Riley's stuffed rabbit from the floor. "Looks like you dropped this, sweetheart," she said gently. She handed it to Riley, palming the note inside the soft fabric of the rabbit's ear. Riley hesitated. Damon's presence loomed beside her. Then, her fingers curled around the rabbit. She nodded just slightly. Naomi forced herself to smile as she stood up. There you go. And as she walked away, she prayed that, when the moment came, Riley would have the courage to answer. Naomi moved quickly, her heart hammering as she returned to the galley. Now, all she could do was wait. The cabin remained quiet, the hum of the engines filling the space between passengers' conversations, the occasional shuffle of someone stretching their legs. To anyone else, this was just another routine flight. But Naomi knew better. She felt the shift in the air. She had set the stage. Now it was up to Riley. From her position near the galley, Naomi kept her movements natural, glancing out over the cabin. Damon was still watching her. His posture hadn't changed, but his eyes followed her with a careful, deliberate intensity. And then, Riley moved. It was slight, just a small shift in her seat, but Naomi saw her little hands squeeze around the rabbit. Then, just for a second, her fingers tugged at the ear. A sign. She had found the note. Naomi's chest tightened. Please, Riley, give me something. Anything. Riley's fingers hesitated. She was scared. Naomi could see it in the way her tiny shoulders stiffened, the way she glanced at Damon without turning her head. But then, slowly, cautiously, she slid her hand into the rabbit's fur and pulled out the crumpled paper. Naomi held her breath. Riley's eyes darted across the words. Do you need help? For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, so quickly it was almost imperceptible, she nodded. Naomi's stomach dropped. That was it. That was the confirmation she needed. But before she could react, Damon moved. He reached over, fast, too fast, and plucked the note from Riley's fingers. Naomi's blood went cold. She watched as he unfolded it, his jaw tightening as he read the words. When he looked up again, his eyes locked onto Naomi's. And this time, there was no polite mask, no charm, just pure, quiet menace. Naomi's breath came shallow. He knows. Damon glanced at his watch. Then so smoothly it was almost casual, he pressed the call button. A soft ding echoed through the cabin. Naomi's pulse spiked. She couldn't ignore it. She had to go over there. Steadying herself, she forced her feet forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached their row, Damon looked up, his expression eerily calm. Excuse me, he said, voice even. Can I get a different seat? Naomi's fingers tightened at her sides. I'm sorry, sir, but we're fully booked today. He smiled. It was a cold, thin smile. Shame. He tapped his fingers lightly against the armrest. I just prefer to sit somewhere I don't feel watched. Naomi didn't blink. Damon leaned in slightly, just enough that only she could hear. You should be careful, he murmured. It's dangerous to make assumptions. Naomi's spine stiffened. Then, still as smooth as ever, he leaned back, stretched his arms, and exhaled like nothing had happened at all. Naomi forced herself to step away, her heartbeat slamming against her ribs. She had pushed him. Now he was pushing back. But one thing was clear. They were running out of time. Naomi moved straight to the cockpit, her body tense as she knocked twice. Cooper opened the door immediately, concern flashing in his eyes. What happened? Naomi didn't waste time. He knows. Cooper's expression darkened. He found the note, she said, voice low. He knows I'm on to him, and he's trying to keep things controlled, but... She exhaled. Captain, he's getting ready. Cooper rubbed a hand down his face. Damn it. We need to be prepared for whatever he tries to pull, Naomi continued. We're still 45 minutes from landing. That's a lot of time for him to make a move. Cooper turned to Grant, who had been listening intently from the co-pilot's seat. Get Miami PD back on the line, he ordered. I don't care if it's too early. I want an armed escort waiting at the gate. And make sure they have someone who can legally detain a minor in case we need to separate her from him immediately. Grant nodded, already typing into the system. Cooper turned back to Naomi. I need you to stay calm. Keep him from panicking. The second he thinks he's out of options, he'll do something reckless. Naomi clenched her jaw. I know. Cooper hesitated. And Naomi? She met his gaze. Be careful. She gave a tight nod. Always. As she turned back toward the cabin, Naomi braced herself. The next 45 minutes would decide everything. Naomi stepped back into the cabin, her pulse steadying, her mind locked on a single goal: keep him calm until landing. Damon hadn't moved. He was still in 14B, one leg crossed over the other, fingers tapping against his knee in a slow, rhythmic motion. But his demeanor had shifted. He wasn't just watching her now, he was calculating. Naomi knew that look. He was planning something. She moved down the aisle, checking in with passengers like nothing was wrong. She didn't dare glance at Riley, though she wanted to. Any sign of concern, any hesitation, and Damon might decide now was the time to act. And they were still 35 minutes from landing. Then suddenly, Damon stood up. Naomi's chest clenched. She turned, forcing her voice to stay neutral. "Sir, please remain seated until the captain turns off the seatbelt sign." Damon smiled. "I just need to stretch my legs." Naomi's eyes flicked to Riley, still stiff in her seat, hands gripping the rabbit so tight her knuckles were white. Damon took a step into the aisle. Naomi blocked him without looking like she was blocking him. "Sir, I can't allow that right now." Damon's jaw tightened. Then, just as quickly, he relaxed again, that smooth, effortless charm sliding back into place like a well-worn mask. "No problem," he said lightly, stepping back into his seat. But as Naomi walked away, she felt the shift. Damon was getting impatient, and that made him dangerous. The plane began its gradual descent. Naomi stayed near the front of the cabin, her body tense as she watched the last crucial minutes tick down. Damon hadn't tried anything else yet, but she could feel it, the tension building, the weight of his options narrowing. Then, a ding from the intercom. "This is your captain speaking. We've begun our descent into Miami International. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, prepare for landing." Naomi's stomach twisted. "Here we go." She made her way toward row 14, keeping her pace steady. Damon was still seated, but something had changed. He wasn't calm anymore. His knee bounced, his fingers curled into loose fists on the armrests. And when his eyes flicked up at her this time, there was no pretense left. He knew this was his last chance. Naomi forced her voice to stay light. "Sir, please fasten your seatbelt." Damon didn't move. The seconds stretched. Then finally, he smiled, a slow, unsettling smirk. And Naomi knew. He was about to do something. Her entire body braced. And then he lunged for Riley. Passengers gasped. A tray table rattled. Naomi moved instantly, shoving between them, arms locking out as she planted herself between Riley and Damon. "Sit down." Her voice was sharp, edged with authority she hadn't even known she possessed. Damon froze. For the first time, he looked unsure. But only for a second. Then he lunged again. Naomi had no time to think. She grabbed his arm, twisting it just enough to throw him off balance. He stumbled, knocking into the row behind him. Passengers screamed. And then, a deep, ferocious growl. Orion. Naomi had never heard the therapy dog make a noise like that before. The German shepherd had been lying at his owner's feet in 20 degrees Celsius the entire flight. But now he was standing, body rigid, ears pinned forward. Damon hesitated, and that was his mistake. Because in that split second of hesitation, two passengers, one a former cop, the other an off-duty firefighter, grabbed him from behind. Damon thrashed, but he was done. Orion barked, sharp and commanding, and that was it. The plane erupted into chaos, and Naomi, chest heaving, adrenaline still surging, grabbed Riley and held her tight. "It's okay," she whispered into the little girl's curls. "It's over." But even as she said it, her hands shook, because in Damon's eyes she didn't see fear. She saw something much worse. She saw a promise. This wasn't over, not even close. Naomi's hands were still trembling as she held Riley close, feeling the girl's rapid heartbeat against her chest. The noise inside the cabin was a chaotic mixture of gasps, whispers, and the clatter of shifting belongings. The turbulence of the descent had nothing on the storm that had just erupted between rows 14 and 20. Damon was pinned down now. The two men, one a former cop, the other a firefighter, held him firm against the seat. His struggle had lasted only seconds, but Naomi knew the real fight wasn't over. His breathing was steady, but his eyes were calculating. He wasn't panicking. He was thinking. That terrified her more than if he had screamed. "Let me go," Damon finally muttered, his voice smooth despite his situation. He knew they weren't the law. He knew they had no authority to detain him, but they didn't need to, because at that moment, Cooper's voice came over the intercom. "Flight attendants, take your seats for landing. Miami security will be meeting us at the gate." Damon's jaw clenched. There it was, the moment he realized he was trapped. Naomi stepped back, still shielding Riley as best she could. The little girl was shaking, her small fingers gripping Naomi's uniform with the force of someone who had spent far too long being afraid to hold on to anything. Naomi leaned down, her voice gentle but firm. "It's okay, Riley. You're safe now." The words felt too fragile, too uncertain, because when she looked up again, Damon was watching her. His lips curled, not in anger, but in something worse. Amusement, like he was already planning his next move. Naomi gritted her teeth. Not this time. Not ever again. The wheels touched down with a jolt. Passengers exhaled collectively, a mixture of relief from landing and residual tension from what had unfolded at 30,000 feet. Naomi didn't move. Her focus stayed locked on Damon. She had seen criminals before, drunk passengers, unruly customers, even smugglers. But none of them had felt like this. Damon wasn't a man who panicked. He wasn't a man who acted out of impulse. Yet he was controlled, even now, pinned down and surrounded. And that scared Naomi more than anything. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged off, but no one stood up. Then, a voice crackled over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Law enforcement is boarding the aircraft." Naomi exhaled. Finally. The front door swung open, and the first officer stepped inside. The badge on his chest gleamed under the overhead lights, and the instant Damon saw it, his mask dropped. The smoothness, the charm, the practiced ease, all of it vanished, and in its place, rage. Pure, unfiltered rage. The officers moved fast, one at the front, one at the back. Damon struggled, but it was over before it started. They yanked him from his seat, his arms forced behind his back, but his eyes never left Naomi. He didn't shout, didn't resist beyond what was necessary to show he wasn't afraid. Instead, as they dragged him past, he leaned in just enough, just so Naomi alone could hear his final words. "You have no idea what you've just done." Naomi's blood ran cold. Damon smirked. And then, he was gone. The tension in the cabin broke. Passengers let out shaky sighs. The flight crew exchanged glances of exhaustion. But Naomi, she stayed frozen, because she knew. Damon hadn't been making a threat. He had been making a promise. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, Naomi realized her fight wasn't over. The moment Damon was dragged off the plane, the weight in Naomi's chest should have lifted. It didn't. Passengers finally started moving, gathering their bags, whispering amongst themselves. Some glanced at Naomi as they passed, grateful, curious, uneasy. But she barely noticed. Her focus was on Riley. The little girl was still in her seat, clutching that rabbit like it was the only solid thing in her world. She hadn't moved since Damon was taken away. She just sat there, small and silent, her wide eyes staring at the aisle like she wasn't sure if it was really over. Naomi crouched beside her. "Riley?" The girl's fingers tightened around the rabbit. Naomi kept her voice gentle. "Honey, we're going to get off the plane now, okay? The officers outside, they're here to help you." Riley didn't answer. But then, slowly, cautiously, she reached out and grabbed Naomi's hand. Naomi's breath hitched. She wasn't sure why it hit her so hard. Maybe because it was the first time Riley had initiated contact. Maybe because it wasn't just a reflex, it was a choice. Either way, Naomi gave her hand a light squeeze and whispered, "I've got you." And Riley, for the first time since Naomi had met her, nodded. Miami police were waiting at the gate. A female officer, Detective Marissa Langley, crouched to Riley's level as soon as she saw her. "Hi, sweetheart. My name's Marissa. You're safe now, okay?" Riley shrank back instinctively. Naomi hated that this little girl, this child, had learned to fear everyone. "She's scared," Naomi murmured, still holding Riley's hand. She hasn't spoken at all. Marissa's face softened. That's okay. We don't have to rush her. Then her gaze lifted to Naomi, her expression shifting into something more serious. Can I speak to you for a moment? Naomi hesitated, glancing at Riley. I'll be right here, Marissa assured her. I promise. Naomi reluctantly let go of Riley's hand and stepped aside with the detective. Marissa's tone lowered. I need you to understand something. What you did up there, it's rare. Most people see something off and look away. But you didn't. You acted. Naomi's stomach tightened. It means Riley is safe, Marissa continued, but it also means Damon Rourke is going to fight this every step of the way. Naomi clenched her jaw. What do you mean? Marissa exhaled. His lawyer's already on the move. He'll claim she was in his legal custody, that you overstepped. Naomi felt like she'd been punched in the gut. You're kidding, Marissa shook her head. Number? And I need you to be prepared. He's not going to disappear into a jail cell overnight. Naomi swallowed hard. So what happens next? Marissa's face was unreadable. That depends. How far are you willing to go? Naomi knew exactly what she was asking. Are you ready for this fight? Because it won't be easy. Naomi looked back at Riley. She was watching from a few feet away, still hugging that stuffed rabbit. But for the first time, she wasn't looking at the ground. She was looking at Naomi, like she trusted her, like she was waiting for Naomi to say she wasn't done fighting. Naomi turned back to Marissa. I'm in. Naomi sat in the Miami precinct, her fingers wrapped around a paper cup of coffee gone cold. She had spent the last 2 hours answering questions, giving her official statement, going over every single moment from the flight. The weight of it all was starting to settle in. Damon wasn't gone. He was in holding, but not for long. He had money, lawyers, connections. He would twist this story however he could. But Naomi wasn't afraid of him anymore, because no matter what happened next, Riley was safe. The precinct door opened. Marissa walked in, a folder tucked under her arm. Naomi sat up. Anything? Marissa nodded. We ran his name through national databases. We're finding patterns. If we dig deeper, we may be able to link him to more missing children. Naomi's stomach turned. You think he's done this before? I think you stopped something bigger than you realized, Marissa said. Naomi's pulse pounded. Marissa hesitated. Then she lowered the folder onto the table and slid it toward Naomi. Inside, a picture, a little girl, blonde hair, blue eyes, missing for 6 months. Naomi's hands went cold. Marissa's voice was quiet. Do you want to help us find her? Naomi didn't hesitate. Yes. And just like that, this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Some heroes don't wear capes. They wear airline uniforms and trust their instincts. Naomi Carter didn't set out to change a life that day, but she did. Because sometimes doing the right thing isn't about being certain. It's about being brave enough to act when something feels wrong. This story isn't just about a flight. It's about the power of paying attention. How many times have we ignored the little signs, the things that didn't sit right? What if someone like Naomi hadn't been there for Riley? So tell me, have you ever trusted your gut and realized later that it saved someone? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want more stories that make you think, feel, and stay on the edge of your seat, don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the smallest action can change everything.